Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome once again to Retribution Studios and episode 2 of our Intro to Magic the Gathering series. Today we're going to be covering the various steps and phases that comprise a turn and a concept called the stack, which is how we explain how spells are resolved. A couple terms I want to go over before we jump into the meat of the video. Spells are any card type other than lands. So artifacts, enchantments, creatures, sorceries, instances. There are spells when they're in your hand, and there are spells when they're on the stack, or they're trying to be resolved, and also in your graveyard. Secondly is permanence. So any type of card that sticks around after it's been played or cast. So lands are included in this. Artifacts, creatures, and enchantments are also permanents because they stay on the battlefield after they finish resolving or been played. To counter a spell, so when you cast a spell, it goes onto the stack. To counter it is to prevent it from resolving, to prevent it from finishing what it wants to do. I just want to kind of set the framework now because that could be confusing now if I didn't set it up. Moving on to the steps and phases. A turn is made up of your beginning step, main phase 1, combat, main phase 2, the end step. So some of these phases are broken down into smaller phases within them, or sub-phases, starting with the beginning step, untap, upkeep, and draw. So during the untap step, the only thing that happens is all your tapped permanents or your used permanents become untapped. They become refreshed. So in the last video, the major card type that I talked about was your lands. So your lands tap for mana. So for example, if I wanted to cast this spell, Quench, it would cost me 2 mana, and one of those mana sources must be blue. So I have this swamp and this island. I'll tap those two and I'll cast Quench. But during the untap phase, let's say it comes back to my turn, I get to untap these so I can use them again. Same is true for all of your permanents. If you have creatures that are tapped, you have artifacts that are tapped, or for some reason you have enchantments that are tapped. Enchantments almost never tap. Then they untap. After the untap step, you can move on to your upkeep step. One thing I want to say about the untap step, is you cannot cast spells. No one can cast spells during anybody's untap step. During the upkeep, any ability that says at the beginning of your turn, the beginning of your upkeep, the beginning of each upkeep, that's where this happens. It happens at that upkeep. This is the first opportunity a player can cast a spell. You can only cast spells in instant speed, so instant spells, obviously, and other exceptions, which I'm going to go over in a later video. We move on to the draw step. So you draw the top card of your library. Once again, players can only cast spells at instant speed. After the draw step is main phase 1, or your pre-combat main phase. This is where you can play a land for turn. You can only play 1 land for turn in either of your main phases. You can cast creatures, artifacts, enchantments, and sorceries. That's the only place you can cast those spells. You can also still cast your instant speed spells. After your main phase comes combat. Combat is a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to actually tilt the camera down to give you a more visual representation with some actual creatures. So we have our, let me rotate this, there we go. Let's say Yuriko and Azra Smoke Shaper are the creatures that I control, and I am the active player. It's my combat, and this Fairy Seer is what Timmy, my opponent, controls. So I choose all the creatures that I want to attack with, and I tap them. So I'm going to declare both of these creatures as attacking Timmy. You can't attack other players' creatures, you attack the player themselves. After I've declared attackers, the next step in combat is declare a blocker. So since I have chosen to attack Timmy with one or more of my creatures, he can choose his creatures to block my creatures. So it gets in the way of the damage that my creatures would do to Timmy's life total. So his Fairy Seer, he's going to choose to block my Azra Smoke Shaper. Why would he choose that one over Yuriko? So Yuriko has a power of 1, and Azra's Smoke Shaper has a power of 3. So if we left those unblocked, Yuriko would do 1 damage to Timmy, Azra's Smoke Shaper would do 3. Not looking at any of the text on the card itself. I'm not trying to overwhelm you guys quite yet. After all blocks have been declared, all damage happens simultaneously. So creatures that are in a blocked or blocking state, they deal damage to each other, and unblocked creatures deal damage to their original target, the player they're attacking. So in the case of Yuriko, she does 1 damage to our opponent, to Timmy. In the case of Fairy Seer and Azra Smoke Shaper, Azra Smoke Shaper is going to deal 3 damage to the Fairy Seer, and the Fairy Seer is going to deal 1 damage to the Azra Smoke Shaper. Now, this is where toughness comes into play. Azra Smoke Shaper's toughness is 3, whereas Fairy Seer only did 1 damage to it. So until the end of the turn, Azra Smoke Shaper has 2 damage, or has 1 damage. If a creature's damage equals or exceeds its toughness, it dies. So in the case of our Fairy Seer friend, he has been dealt 3 damage from the from the Azra Smoke Shaper. So he's dead. He dies. He goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. After that's been finished, we move back to main phase. Hold on 1 second. Main phase 2. Main phase 2 is identical in every way to main phase 1. You can play a land if you haven't in main phase 1. You can cast your creature, artifact, enchantment, sorcery spells in this phase. Once again, you can also cast instant speed spells. You can cast them at any time that you're eligible to cast a spell. The end of main phase 2, you move on to the end step. Any ability, just like your upkeep, that says at the end of your turn or at the beginning of your end step or the beginning of each end step, that happens at this time, at the end step. Once again, you can only cast instant speed spells during the end step. After the end step is over, you move on to the end of the end step, which is called the cleanup step. During the cleanup step, active player discards down to his maximum hand size, which by default is 7. So hypothetically, let's say I had these cards in my hand. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and I don't have an effect that increases my hand size. I have to discard 2 cards to discard down to 7. After that's done, all creatures remove damage. They go back to their maximum toughness. So in the case of our Azra Smoke Shaper, he had 1 damage dealt to him. He goes back to 0. He is back at maximum toughness. So that is the structure of a turn. The next concept I want to go over is called the stack, and I mentioned that a couple times. I need to make sure I didn't lose the spell I was going to talk about. I'm not sure where I put it. Probably in my deck. Hold on, let me find a replacement real quick. Okay, that'll do. Okay, so it's my main phase. My opponents are Timmy, Johnny, and Spike. I choose to cast, actually get the lands. I'm gonna show you. Okay. So these are my lands that I have in play. I have 2 islands and a swamp, and I choose to cast Mind Rot. And now Mind Rot reads, target player discards 2 cards. So as part of casting this spell, I have to declare one of my opponents as the target of the spell. So I picked Spike. Spike, discard 2 cards. Now, I have the opportunity to cast another spell before allowing anyone else the opportunity, or what we call priority, to respond to this. I'm all tapped out for mana, and I'm gonna give Timmy the opportunity to respond. Let's say Timmy passes. We move on to Johnny. Johnny now has the opportunity. He has priority. Let's say he passes priority. Spike now has the opportunity. If he were to pass, then Mind Rot would resolve. It would go to my graveyard, and Spike has to discard 2 cards. Let's say Spike does have a response. So he's got 2 blue mana up, and he casts Mana Drain. It says counter target spell at the beginning of your next main phase. Add an amount of colorless mana equal to that spell's converted mana cost. So to counter the spell means to prevent it from being resolved. It goes to, if countered, it goes to the controller's graveyard. And in the case of Mana Drain, Spike's gonna get 3 mana in his next main phase on his turn. So I'm the active player. I get to choose whether I want to respond to Spike's Mana Drain first. Once again, I'm tapped out. I probably don't have a response. Timmy gets the opportunity to respond. Johnny gets the opportunity to respond. Spike gets the opportunity to respond. If no one responds, Mana Drain resolves. Spike is countered and put into the graveyard, and we move on to the next thing. And those are the basics. Those are the fundamentals of the stack. I'm gonna go in the next episode. I'm gonna go over activated abilities and triggered abilities and how those work on the stack, and also a card type that I have not covered yet because it's just a lot more complicated than the others, Planeswalkers. So I will see you next time. I plan to post probably sometime in this week, hopefully on Thursday. Maybe I'm gonna try to do Tuesdays and Thursdays. I think that's not terrible. Oh, today's Sunday. I'm like way ahead. I don't know. I'm figuring this out still. Be kind to each other, be excellent, and have a great one.